All right, welcome everybody. Today we're going to talk about writing your disadvantage statement and COVID statements for your applications. My name is Joanne Snap, and we're going to start with disadvantaged. Not every application has a disadvantage statement, but medicine and dentistry does. Some schools will ask you for some type of disadvantage, whether you had a disadvantage or if you've had any challenges in your life, and sometimes those appear in secondary questions as well. So even if you don't use this specifically for your primary application, a lot of this information is very applicable to your secondary questions that you're going to see. But for AMCAS, I know we have some MD folks in here, you have a very specific spot in your application that is a disadvantage statement. And I want to start with just kind of thinking about or talking about what does this mean if you self-identify as disadvantaged. I know that I've heard for a lot of years that some students are really unsure either if they're disadvantaged or whether they want to identify in that way. So I thought we could carve out just a few minutes and talk about that. If you are on the side of the fence where you are not sure if you are disadvantaged, I'm going to go through all the criteria of whether you are or aren't, and I think that will help you a lot. But the bigger question is whether you should put it. First of all, being disadvantaged is a purely self-identified characteristic. So they're not going to verify anything that you put in this section. They're not going to ask for any documentation or anything like that. So if you wanted to disclose that you received social services as a kid, if you were on free and reduced lunch, if any of the disadvantages that you list, you don't have to prove any of that. It's simply a way for the schools to create a historic context that they use. So they read this before they usually read the personal statement, and certain apps it appears before that. But this helps them understand your historic level of need or your historic level of disadvantage. So you might have heard phrases like underserved or underrepresented, and those are not the same thing as being disadvantaged. So underserved would be if you lived in a zip code or a county that had they didn't have enough physicians or health professionals per capita. And you can find out whether your county was underserved by actually Googling it. You can quickly figure out if your zip code was underserved. But that doesn't mean you are disadvantaged. Also, being underrepresented in healthcare doesn't mean that you're automatically disadvantaged. That's a completely different category and issue, which is not the same thing. So you could have been underserved and underrepresented and not be disadvantaged. What disadvantage means is that something in your life got in the way of you having access to resources that would have allowed you to reach some potential that you feel that maybe you weren't able to reach because of a lack of some resources or some situation in your life. So there's a lot of gray area with that, and I think that's intentional because this opens the opportunity for people to identify as disadvantaged in a lot of different ways. So a disadvantage statement, at least in AMCAS, is 1325 characters, which is a nice chunky paragraph. In your secondary questions, they are going to vary between, it could be 500 words, it could be 1500 characters, it could be 5000 characters. It really varies by school. So generally, I would encourage you, if you're thinking that you want to do this, to write a general statement that can be adapted for different types of questions. But if we're thinking about what you're going to see in the primary application, a disadvantage is one of three things, and these are really broad categories. So an economic disadvantage is if you received any type of free and reduced lunch, any social service benefits, or maybe your parents didn't apply for those, or your guardians didn't apply for those, but maybe you know that you were struggling, your family was struggling financially growing up. So if there were any indicators of financial hardship growing up, you're more than likely economically disadvantaged. Another way to tell is if you got a Pell Grant. If you came into college receiving a Pell Grant from the government, that's also often an indicator that your family was financially disadvantaged. On your financial aid package, if your EFC, your estimated family contribution, is 0, that would indicate that your family was having financial struggles. Most people know this. Sometimes parents or guardians do a really good job of hiding that or camouflaging their struggles. But what I found over the years is that most students know if their family was struggling. So aside from that, you can have that. You can have an economic disadvantage, or you could not have an economic disadvantage. For example, you could have had, two physician parents and lived in a gated community and had no financial need, but still be disadvantaged. If your environment was unsafe in any way, and what this looks like sometimes is if you lived in a home where there was, extreme mental illness and there was any type of abuse or dysfunction, if there was drugs or alcohol abuse in your home, if you lived in an unsafe neighborhood where you couldn't go outside and play, or you lived in a community where maybe it was really, really small, like there were 500 people and there was no library, there were no parks, there was nothing that created any type of enrichment for you growing up. Any type of environment you grew up in that just generally wasn't safe, including if you immigrated to America and your home country was, not safe for any reason. Sometimes I've read stories where people just talk about the immigration process and the stress that caused them. That could be an example. It's not that immigrating to the United States alone was a disadvantage, but if the process of doing that was unsafe, that would be an example of that. And then the last general category is an educational disadvantage. And sometimes people will go and look up their schools to see if it was a title school, or a title school is a school where a certain percentage of the school was low income, they received free and reduced lunch. But if the education system you were in is, like, let's say you find out they're in the top 5 or the bottom 5% of the state, they are the lowest performing school in the state, that would be a really clear indication that you were in an educationally disadvantaged area. Sometimes maybe you didn't go to the lowest performing school, but you just know that your education was subpar because maybe your teachers, turned on The Price is Right during class, and that's what you did in your biology classes. You watched TV. Or maybe your teachers were planning their wedding during your classes. I mean, I've heard all kinds of things where that you didn't get the type of education that you needed that would have prepared you for college. And so if that's the case, kind of putting that out there and explaining what happened during your the majority of your K through 12 education that kind of held you back in that way. So these descriptors in your disadvantage statement, these are facts. This isn't a flowery story or anything like that. You are literally just going to tell us what the situation was so that they can better understand the circumstances that affected your outcome. At the end of the day, everybody is going to arrive at the same spot. So you are all going to apply to your health profession. And just arriving at that starting line of applying is a huge success in life. And so everyone arrives at that success. But there's this concept called distance traveled in admissions. And what that distance traveled means is that if you have 2 applicants and one applicant, let's say they came from a 2-parent household where both parents were highly educated, they both had professional jobs, they made a decent income, the person had every resource they needed, they got to go to every summer camp, they got SAT prep, they got, they didn't have to work during college, they got a good MCAT prep course, everything they needed was always given to them. When that person arrives at success, no one's really surprised, right? Like that was almost like an expectation. It's still celebrated, but it's not anything that nobody's gonna blink an eye about that. Take another person, let's say, who grew up in a single parent household, who had to start taking care of their siblings at a really young age, who never got sent to any summer camps, who didn't know what the SAT was and didn't prepare for it well, struggled, was a first gen, had to go to college, had to work 2 jobs to put themselves through college, probably struggled a tiny bit in college because they were adjusting and had to do so much while they were taking classes. Maybe they had to repeat classes, maybe they had to stay a 5th year, maybe they had to do a post-bac program. And so when they finally arrive at that same place, success, applying to the health profession, it's even though we're also celebrating that, we can't, like, if we fail to acknowledge what that person went through to get to that point, it would really be inequitable, right? If we assume that both people who arrive at that same space are the same, that wouldn't be really fair to say that. And so the schools like to know where you're coming from and what you went through to get to that point of success, because it makes a difference in helping them understand your resilience, your persistence, and just who you are as a person. I know that we oftentimes, students don't want to sort of say like, well, what my parents or my guardians put me through, or what we went through as a kid, or all these things I did or experienced, that's not me. That I don't want to be defined in that way. I want to move on past that. But I really encourage you to think about who you are as a person today probably has a lot to do with where you came from and what you overcame as a child. You might not see it quite yet in just sort of developmentally where you are in your life, but I assure you that you probably have some strengths and some skills that you developed because of where you came from, whether that is being a self-directed learner, being able to seek out information on your own, being able to, not crumble when someone is, rude or yells at you, being able to deal with conflict, being able to, work hard and not, tire easily. When I work with people who've never been yelled at in their lives and they have their first job and a customer just cusses them out and yells at them, they always write about how they cried and this and that. Well, if you've had a lot of experiences with conflict, you tend to be a little bit more capable of handling things like that. And so those are strengths that, even though you might say, I don't want to talk about that stuff, these are strengths that the schools are actually looking for in you. And so when you tell these stories of what you've overcome, no one's going to feel sorry for you. No one's going to read this and go, oh my gosh, this is so sad. No, they're going to look at that and go, oh wow, I can easily see how this person brings tremendous value to the health profession because of the things that they've seen, the perspective they have, the resiliency that they've built, and just the skills that they now carry with them throughout life. I'm going to pause. Does that make sense to everybody? Is anybody not sure what I mean by any of this? Okay. Here are some more examples of other kinds of disadvantages that I've seen. I mentioned having mental illness or substance abuse in the home. Sometimes parents have mental illness that wasn't necessarily diagnosed. If you're, as an adult now looking back and you realize that there was definitely some type of mental illness happening, but there was never a diagnosis, I think it's okay to still mention that there's some possibility that there was some, at least you could call it dysfunctional behavior and describe that. So oftentimes I read a lot of stories about maybe mother, and it's not always mothers, but like a mother who was bipolar who wouldn't take the medication, and as a result that created a very volatile household for the applicant. And so in just stating those things, again, gives the reader a perspective of what that person overcame to get to where they are. And then if anyone was ever homeless, that is 100% a disadvantage. You should 100% mention that and just explain the circumstances. If you were in foster care, if you, anything like that, if you were ever removed from your home, that would be a very clear example of a disadvantaged background. If either of your parents have passed away, I would consider putting that, even if that happened in college. Usually disadvantages are historic, so prior to age 18. But in some cases, if your parents passed away, I would consider putting that as a disadvantage, and even, like I said, even if it occurs in college. If you had to raise yourself or your parent or your siblings because your parents worked a lot or were absent for any reason whatsoever, put that in there. And then, of course, so I don't want to trigger anybody, but if you're comfortable enough to talk about anything that you went through yourself in terms of any type of abuse, you can certainly put that in there, and that also gives them some perspective. I will say a lot of people are concerned about disclosing things like that. For example, talking about abuse or mental illness or like eating disorders, because they're afraid that the schools are going to see that and think that, oh, this person might carry some, residual trauma with them as they enter medical school or dental school. And I think if you're going to bring up topics like that, first of all, I don't think that there is anything to be afraid of to disclose those issues about yourself. However, what you want to focus on at the end is your healing. So for example, you can write, through much therapy and self-reflection and work on myself, I've overcome much of the childhood trauma that I experienced, and now I'm very interested in practicing trauma-informed care in my future. So you can talk about just what your healing process looked like and how you are in an okay place right now. One thing that will indicate that you're in an okay place right now are your grades. And if you oftentimes people who have disadvantage statements, it's not 100%, so I'm not saying this is always the case, but sometimes people who have disadvantage statements have a rocky first year in college, because sometimes adjusting to a very rigorous, fast-paced academic setting like college can be actually a traumatizing experience in and of itself. And so if your first year grades are a little rocky, they're not going to look at that and honestly think anything. What they're going to do is they're going to look at your last 2 years of college and see how you have gained in your skills in terms of being a student. And so if you have if you've proven that you can handle your health profession by demonstrating that upward trend, then you don't really need to address that. You don't need to say anything. You don't need to be as concerned about their fear about what you're saying, because your grades have demonstrated that you're okay now. Sometimes, like I said, the residual trauma from childhood appears in our first and second year of college, but over time, as you grow as a person, a lot of people take care of that during college. They seek out help, they use their resources, they go to counseling, and then we usually see by the third or fourth year of college that people have come full circle. I don't know if anybody resonates with that story. Feel free to share or chime in. I'm happy to not do all the talking as well. Does anybody have anything they want to add to that? Okay. How would medical schools use this information? So let's say you put yourself as disadvantaged, and what do they do with that? So when you're going to be flagged, when I say flagged, I mean that schools use filters. They use internal filters that they create in the application systems to sort of sort people into piles. And truthfully, you want to be sorted into piles, because the pile applying to any health profession is huge. It could be 1,000 people, it could be 6,000 people, but still being one of 6,000 feels really daunting, right? So if you get sorted into piles, that means you're going to be compared against a smaller number of people. So when they filter, they usually filter people into piles, like there could be a reapplicant pile, there could be a disadvantaged pile, there could be other piles. And so if they put you in a disadvantaged pile, what that means is that when you get screened, when the person reads your application, they're going to only read you relative to other disadvantaged people. That means that you won't ever be compared to the person who had the 2 physician parents and lived in a gated community and had everything they needed. They're going to be read, their application will be read in a separate pile. So when they're reading disadvantaged applicants side by side, then everything in this process is relative. And that's honestly, everything in life is relative, right? So when they're reading applications, they'll read a person, and that's going to elicit a feeling in the screener, that's because they're human beings who read. And as much as schools want to try to reduce bias, it's very difficult to reduce human bias. So we're going to read an application, we're going to feel a certain way about someone, and then we're going to read another application. How one feels about that person is relative to how they felt about the person before them. And I'm just being honest with you guys about how that works, because you could imagine how, as a reader, and you're reading app after app, so if one person writes that their disadvantage is that, their parents got divorced and they had to go back and forth between 2 houses, and then the next person writes that they were homeless and they didn't have a house, what are our thoughts? If I just read that, my parents got divorced and I had to go between 2 houses, my thought is, well, at least you had 2 houses, right? And so it's relative in the sense that you don't have to outdo in terms of disadvantage, but if you're going to put something like, my parents got divorced, you've got to acknowledge that there are people who are applying with a lot of disadvantages. And so I would say any of the ones that I just listed are absolutely disadvantages, and you should 100% consider putting that if that applies to you. But sometimes I think people consider putting themselves as disadvantaged because of what I just said in terms of putting themselves in a smaller pile. But if you put things that are not what the person reading your app deem as disadvantaged, it could actually serve to hurt you, because they might be saying, well, you're saying you're over here disadvantaged, whereas I just read someone who really was disadvantaged. So if you are not sure if you're disadvantaged, what I would encourage you to do is to write it out and then come to drop-ins on Wednesdays and let one of the professional staff read it and we'll just give you our perspective. You don't have to use it, but we'll just tell you what we think, and then you can decide for yourself if, based on what we think, if you're okay with that. And so that's a good way, is letting some other people give you their perception of what you're writing. That way you don't have to make that decision on your own. If someone reads this and goes, wow, I can really see how this situation might have held you back, and yeah, I definitely think you're disadvantaged, and that taught me a lot about you, that would be a good indication that you should move forward with your disadvantage statement. So that would be my advice to you if you're really, really not sure if you should write something. If any of you want to private message me and ask if your situation is disadvantaged, I'm happy to kind of talk through that right now. If you don't want to share your situation with everyone, I can certainly just keep you anonymous and talk about the situation so that everyone can kind of benefit from your question. So feel free to shoot that to me if you have any questions. They don't usually, I have never read a disadvantage statement. That makes me feel sorry for anybody. That just simply doesn't happen. When people are reading disadvantage statements, it's usually, so your screener is there for one purpose. They're trying to figure out whether they should invite you to interview. And they're going to determine whether they should invite you to interview based on the value that you bring to that school. So it's very pragmatic. It's really like, how useful is this person, and what can they do for the world? What can they do for healthcare? What can they do for us? So when you think about why they're reading your statement, it's not personal. It's really just, what am I going to take from this story or this situation that helps me understand how this person can operate in a healthcare setting. So I talked about the risk of doing this. I don't think it's super risky. It's just one of those things where you need to be aware that everything needs to line up. So what do I mean by that? In some cases, I've read statements in the past that don't really make sense with the rest of the narrative that appears in the application. So for example, in your applications, you're often asked to put your parents' income, your parents' occupations, and in some applications you actually put how much how you paid for college and how much money you're in your household, and and how many people live in your household. So it gives them a really good idea quantitatively how your financial situation played out as a kid. So if you're writing that you were financially disadvantaged and painting this picture, but then in your financial, your quantitative part where you're listing your income, you put $150,000 for 3 people, that doesn't really line up, right? That's not necessarily a low income. Same thing, I remember a story from a few years ago. A person wrote a disadvantage statement about being financially disadvantaged as a kid, and then I got to his personal statement, and he wrote stories about how every year his family would fly to India. His whole family would fly to India and then donate goods for those who were living in poverty in India. And I had to take a step back and be like, wait, what? So you just told me that you were living low income, but then every year your family took an international flight to India? I was like, I don't know how that works. I mean, I grew up pretty low income, and we were not taking any trips anywhere. I mean, we weren't even going an hour away. We were pretty stuck in our city. So I don't, it's not, I try not to be judgmental about that, but it's sort of like, doesn't make sense to an average person. So you got to make sure what you're saying throughout your entire application makes sense with one another, because they're going to be reading your whole 30-page app in about 5 minutes in one sitting. So your personal statement, your disadvantage statement, your experiences, your secondaries, your letters of rec, all of that bulk of info is going in their heads in 5 or so minutes. So you got to make sense as a whole, right? So that doesn't happen all the time, but I just throw that out there because it's happened before, so you want to think about that. All right, I wanted to give you an example of a couple of disadvantage statements just to give you an idea of like how they could be written. So I'm going to give you a second and just let you read this, and then you can tell me what you think about it. All right. What, any thoughts? Does this make you feel sorry for the person? Again, feel free to unmute and share if you want to talk.
Sure, I could just jump in for a little bit. After reading this, I think the main thing that I notice is just it's very to the point, like direct. She kind of just lists out all of the different things, without necessarily making it more like a sob story or anything, just kind of listing kind of just the things that happened to her.
Mm-hmm. Yep, and there's I'm guessing like this person has a lot of things, right? Even that usually when someone comes from a situation like this, there's so much that they could say in terms of how this affected them, and probably there's so much more. But you think about what were the big things that highlight. So where do you see the financial challenge here? We see eating at food kitchens and having groceries dropped off, and then the environmental is the volatile behavior and just living with people who are not mentally well. And then you have the environmental or the academic, where this person was clearly, suffering in school but not getting any type of support or help from her parents. So how did this person process all of this? Well, and they're kind of trying to show what they bring to healthcare, which is I'm very sensitive towards others. I'm very aware when I meet someone who's suffering, and this person will probably understand that people are going through things that you can't always tell right on the outside. That's what trauma informed care is, and so making sure that you're sensitive and compassionate towards all people, considering that many people are carrying traumas that don't necessarily appear in any medical history. So Nicholas wrote, no, he didn't feel sorry for this person. Did anybody else have any sort of negative response to this? Like it felt too negative or too anything? I'm, I'm not saying this is like the best one ever. It's just an example of one. Could have elaborated more. Yeah. I didn't check the character count on this. She might have a little bit of room to expand more. Do you mean, Angel, do you think she could have talked more about how this affected her, or what, what is the value that she brings? What do you think she could have done better?
Yeah, I was gonna say like if she talked more of how this could relate to her career and like what she's gonna do to change for the better for healthcare.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so just a little bit more of that at the end. Okay, very cool. Any other thoughts? I'm gonna show you one more, and then we're gonna move on to COVID statements. Um, Here's another one. You can read this one really quick. Does anybody feel sorry for this person? Does anybody feel inspired by this person? You guys have feelings? I'm just teasing. Inspired, yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's generally how people feel when they read disadvantage statements. They're not, most people don't go into an application thinking about it as, like I said, as an emotional thing. It's more just like, how can we imagine that this person is going to be helpful in their future because of what they saw and what they lived through. So you can see here that, the environmental disadvantage, growing up in a city of 450 people, probably, even though she didn't say it, I could assume that there weren't a lot of resources available. And then anytime you can quantify things, so, mentioning the bottom 10%, if you can add details like that, it just helps sort of paint that picture and make it more clear what that means. I don't think you need to talk about where your inspiration came from. I don't have a problem with this person doing this, but that's not usually how disadvantage statements go. There's not going to be this is the best way to do this. You can take whatever approach you want. You saw 2 different approaches to writing this. You can take whatever approach you want to take, but I would just strongly recommend trying to keep it a little bit moving. Don't stay in one situation too long, unless you have one significant disadvantage, and then you can kind of explain what that was and how that affected you. But definitely it's not a story. It's not putting me in a moment and showing me what happened. That's not what it is. Okay, so that's what I have for disadvantage statements. Last call for questions regarding disadvantage statements. Yeah, Stephanie?
Hi, good morning. I was just wondering if you had any tips for, I guess, figuring out when to expand on something versus when not to.
Okay.
I think I'm struggling a little bit with that in terms of, should I expand more on this situation but not in this one, and that sort of thing. I think that's the biggest challenge for me right now.
Okay.
Thank you.
One way I will say that is, I always ask is, if you can talk about it out loud, if you have a situation that was maybe a little traumatizing for you, if you can literally talk about it out loud without getting emotional, that would be something that you could expand upon. But if you are still triggered when you start to talk about it, it's not that you can't or shouldn't talk about it in your application. You just know that you're going to have to put in the work to get past that emotional response before you go to an interview, because anything you mention in your application is fair game for them to bring up in your interviews. So for example, with this person, she brought up her sexual assault. If she goes to an interview and the person wants to ask about that, she needs to be able to have a conversation about that. And so that would be one criteria that I would use, is how comfortable are you talking about it. And then the other thing is, I would think about, and I hate saying this, it sounds terrible, but think about the practical value of sharing it. What do I learn about you in the sense of what do you bring to the table in relation to healthcare? So if you had to choose between elaborating on 2 situations, which one shows me something that's going to be more indicative of how you're going to approach your future? And maybe they're both equally valuable. And in that case, you're just going to have to choose which one makes the most sense, which one, I guess, impacted you more, which one had the greater influence on how you see the world right now. But, it's such a short paragraph. You obviously are not going to be able to tell your whole story. The good news is in secondaries, they give you a lot more space to kind of expand on challenges you faced. So there's usually a challenge question, an adversity question, things you've overcome, obstacles you've overcome. So I'm going to be doing 2 secondary workshops at the end of June. If you are able to come to those, I'm going to talk a lot more about the challenge question and overcoming obstacles question. So we'll talk, I think that might be helpful for you too, to just consider that it's not only one spot where you get to talk about your life challenges. You have more spaces to do that. One thing I would highly recommend that you not do, though, is don't make your entire personal statement about the challenges that you faced in life. If you want to talk about a challenge in life in a paragraph in your personal statement, try to do so leading it into how this impacted, like how this influenced the way that you want to approach your career in the future. If you're just dropping random stories about bad things that happened to you, I'm going to read your personal statement and just wonder, like, why am I reading this? I'm supposed to be here trying to figure out why you want to be a dentist or why you want to be a doctor, and I don't know why I'm reading this random story about this bad thing. So if you're going to do that, just make sure it's framed in a useful way. I had a personal question. It's not necessary, it's not a bad thing if we choose to not write a disadvantaged statement. No, it's not a bad thing. Let's say that they think you're disadvantaged because your family income is low and maybe there's some other indicators that you might have been disadvantaged, and you choose not to write about it. So you realize that you have no place to explain what the circumstances are. So if you had any type of hiccups in your academic career, not that you're directly explaining your grades in your disadvantage statement, but you're not giving them any context to understand what might have been, culprit in that. So you don't have to. They're just going to go, wow, he's clearly disadvantaged, but doesn't identify that way. But then at the same time, they don't have any answers to their questions. I would say if you are actually disadvantaged and you don't write it, in my opinion, you are not helping yourself, because all they're trying to figure out in 5 minutes or less is who are you as a person. And we can't disconnect who we are as people today from where we came from. It's very difficult to say that where we came from as children and where we grew up and our parents and all of that had nothing to do with who we are today. Happy to get into a philosophical debate with you about that, but I really believe in my heart that you are who you are because of that. Would it be worse to be disadvantaged and not write about it, or to not be disadvantaged? I would say it would be worse to not be disadvantaged and submit a disadvantaged statement. I think that would be judged more harshly than if you were and chose not to write it. The only thing that's lost if you are disadvantaged and you don't write about it is they have no context. But if you're claiming to be disadvantaged and you're clearly not, now they think that you have no sense of what a true disadvantage in life looks like. Meaning you haven't had any exposure to poverty, you haven't seen disadvantaged communities, and so sometimes people haven't had the opportunity to work with underserved or disadvantaged communities, and they really don't know what that looks like. And in that case, they might think that they have a disadvantage, which is a shortcoming on their part, because you're going to work with people from low-income backgrounds in healthcare, and it would be really good to understand where they're coming from. So if that applies to any of you, if you're thinking, well, I haven't really had any experiences that have exposed me to people who come from either live in situations of poverty or come from dysfunctional backgrounds, things like that, it might be a good thing to pursue opportunities that put you in those situations, just so you can expand your worldview a little bit, and it'll help you a lot when you write your applications and when you get into healthcare, because those are going to be your patients. Those are the people you're going to serve. And culturally, there's a lot of difference culturally between affluence and poverty, and understanding what that looks like, understanding how people in poverty view health, view themselves, view healthcare professionals is really, really valuable. All right, I'm going to move on to COVID. It won't take too long. There's not a ton of stuff to say about it, but we're going to touch upon it. So you're going to be asked either through secondary applications or in your primary, depending on your application. So AMCAS doesn't have a COVID statement. I'll be honest, I haven't looked at AACOMAS yet this year. Did anybody open up their AACOMAS? Is the COVID statement still there this year? Love to know that if you happen to take a look. Has anybody opened up AACOMAS yet? Maybe you can look it up for me and let me know. So in the past, there's been a COVID statement in AACOMAS and some of the other applications as well. It's usually 2,500 characters, and I'm going to post the prompt in just a minute. But some big things we want to consider when we're thinking about writing any type of COVID essay, if they ask you, how has COVID affected you? So obviously everyone in some way, shape, or form suffered from COVID. And I think it's really important as you are exploring how COVID affected you to consider your audience. In most cases, the people reading your application are going to be those from your health profession. So for example, if you're applying to medical school, the people reading your application are usually physicians. And we don't know what type of physician they are, but for a lot of physicians, they were impacted greatly by COVID. But let's just assume the worst. Let's assume that they were an ICU physician, I don't know, an ER physician. They saw so much, right? Like they went through the worst of it, and they saw so much suffering. And now this person with this perspective about how COVID affected them is going to read your COVID statement about how COVID affected you. So think about the tone you're taking when you're writing your COVID statement. And I'm not trying to be insensitive. I just want you to consider that the person reading your app is a real person. So if you take your situation and you're going to be touching upon how COVID affected you academically, financially, professionally, in the sense of like opportunities that you might have lost, and then of course your health if you got sick or someone near you got sick. If you are talking about that in a very sort of like over dramatized way where it's really like, woe me, everything was awful, this was the worst thing that's ever happened to me, and unless it really was bad, like if it was really bad, let it be known that it was really bad. But you've got to remember how your audience is going to perceive that. Everybody suffered in some way, so it would be much better if you just state the facts, and if there is anything that you can say that's positive, you could reflect on that. There's no reason to say, you don't have to make up bad things just to have bad things. You can actually say that, although you could say I recognize my privilege and being able to stay in a safe place, and I didn't have to work jobs that were unsafe for me. However, I really wanted to give back, and so I saw an opportunity to become an EMT, and from that I saw something really valuable about healthcare. How did COVID teach you something that you wouldn't have otherwise gained because you lived through, all of you lived through as adults, one of our biggest historical events in the world. And so if you can think about how you learned anything from that about medicine, about healthcare, about anything, it's okay to also be positive and reflect on that as well. I don't think everything has to be negative in this reflection about how COVID affected you. I thought I saw a hand. Was it Stephanie? Did I see your hand? No?
Sorry, I think that was from previous.
Oh, okay. No worries. This is an example of the prompts that AACOMAS had for the COVID statement last year. And I think, I want to say a couple of the other apps, I don't know who else is in here right now, but a couple of the other apps have this. Most of the med school secondary questions are, I think, a little bit more reflective. They're more like, what did you learn about medicine from COVID? Which is a completely different question, right? It's not how did COVID affect you, but more what I was talking about, what did you learn about public health? What did you learn about mistrust in our society in regards to science? What did you learn about how our government handled it, about how, things were changing? And what did you learn about science in regard to the fact that there was no cure for COVID at the beginning, and there was a lot of experimental medicine happening where they had to figure out how to treat COVID at the beginning? I mean, there's so much that really opened our eyes about, you could talk about the disparities between some of our most vulnerable and marginalized communities. And so you could take any of those topics that are really impactful to you, that are meaningful to you, and you could talk about what you learned about that from COVID. So this is a chance for you to kind of shine in terms of how you think and how you reason and just how you see the world and what you care about. If you're really like into science and everybody is, but like, let's say like what most fascinated you about COVID was how the scientists in the community, collaborate, and how researchers across the nation work together in some cases to move forward with an effective vaccination. Maybe just the vaccination approval process, the clinical trials, all of that. Maybe that was really fascinating to you. It doesn't matter. Just if there's a question about what did you learn from it, pick something that's meaningful to you and really reflect on that, and try to say something that highlights some change within you, some understanding that occurred. Let's see. In regards to what we learned about COVID in medicine, we don't necessarily need to talk about our own experiences. We can talk about things we observed in society. Either or and both. Nicholas, if you had a personal experience, like for example, if you worked in a hospital during COVID and you saw firsthand, for example, let's say you saw how administration limited PPE for scribes and scribes had to recycle their masks. Well, that might have given you a really good insight into sort of what happens when a crisis occurs in healthcare, and how maybe it opened your eyes to just how unprepared America is for crises like this. So it could be something like that, or you can just talk about something you learned, and it doesn't have to be something you actually saw. Either one. All right, here is an example of a COVID statement that's more just, this is how it affected me. I'll let you read that for a second. I'm not saying this is like the ideal answer. It's just an answer that lets you see how it could be approached. I have read so many different versions of this, and each person kind of takes their own approach to it. So if you feel like there's a natural way that you would want to write about this, like let yourself write about it the way that you are inclined to write about it. Unless you are saying anything offensive or, like I said, making it overly dramatized about how terrible everything in your life was at that point, you're probably okay. A couple things I probably would avoid doing is talking about how COVID caused you to like go into online classes and how that caused if you got bad grades during that time. Because you got to remember that most health profession schools also went online, and all of their students were also taking online classes. And so if you're saying that you can't adapt, and you can't adapt quickly, and if you happen to need to go online during your health profession school, if that means that you're going to fail or struggle in that case, that would be a red flag. So focusing more on how you adapted would be better than just blaming your online classes for any bad grades that you got. Angel, I am not sure if this is going to be their next cycle. It's hard to say how long COVID is going to stick around in our world in terms of just like how we're addressing it. I wasn't even sure if they were going to ask about it this year. Secondaries haven't come out yet, so I haven't really seen whether they're going to, but I'm just assuming they probably will, because we were still affected by COVID in 2021. We had that big surge this winter actually, and so I'm guessing they're still going to be talking about it, but I could be way wrong. They might just realize they've had enough of this and they're going to take it all out and ask different questions. So we won't know until we get to that point, unfortunately. So that's all I had for COVID. Does anybody have any questions about COVID or anything else related to that? Or actually anything. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer any questions that you have about the application. If you've opened it up and you're looking at it. Yeah, you're welcome. If you have any questions, if you are writing your application, if you're doing your personal statement, your experience descriptions, your disadvantage statement, if you need help thinking about how to approach your CASPER, anything like that, feel free to come to drop-ins. Both Dr. Kravetsky and I are there on Wednesdays from 2 to 4 p.m. And it's been really nice just getting to talk to some of you in person, so feel free to come by and you can meet with either one of us and we can help you with your application preparation. this is not an intuitive process, right? Like there's a lot of things to keep in mind. So you don't have to do this by yourself. You have free and available resources to help you. So take advantage of that. So with that, nope, not intuitive at all. With that,
This has been great, Joanne. Thank
oh,
you.
thank you, Charlie.
Um,
Yeah, any other
I would
questions?
just say, like, following up this presentation and this really great information to our students, now is the time, if you haven't, to start this process. So start writing. AMCAS, AACOMAS have opened. I know maybe some of you, I saw somebody mention dentistry. Writing is a process. It's not, even these statements aren't necessarily done just right at the moment. And we're here to support you, but we found that early writing is better than last minute writing. So as Joanne shared with today's workshop, and also the Wednesday writing support from 2 to 4, we have that available. The upcoming workshops, we have a personal statement workshop coming up on May 10th. All of this information you can find out on our website, hpac.ucr.edu. You can sign up for those workshops there. Most of our workshops we're putting on our YouTube channel, which you can also find linked to our website. But the really cool thing about this type of format is that you have access to Joanne here. So you're able to, share some of the things that she's covering, respond to those, maybe your specific situation or how you might work through a prompt. So we really want you to be working on this early as you can. As you know, that this is usually the application comes and goes pretty quickly. It's rolling. So we want to support you, but we want to support you now versus you panicking and trying to get your information in down the road.
Yes, no panicking, no panicking.
Yeah. So we have some time. We want you to utilize these fantastic resources that are here. And with that, I know we're getting close to the top of the hour, but Joanne, did you have anything else before we wrap up today?
No, just thank you all so much for coming, and I hope I get to meet you one-on-one when you come by drop-ins.
Right. Thank you, Joanne, for this workshop. As always, we appreciate